Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Australian Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. I'm Professor Jing Han, the director of this institute. Before we start, as usual, I would like to acknowledge that our institute is on Parramatta South Campus, which is on the country of the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and acknowledge their ancestors who have been the traditional owners of their country for thousands of years. We will also want to pay our respect to the First Nations elders of the countries we are all sitting on today, past, present, and emerging. We started the Chinese Australian History series with Dr. Michael Williams in 2020, and we have since built up interest in Chinese Australian history nationally and internationally. The three series have covered a range of topics, but there are more topics to be covered, and some topics need to be covered in more depth, such as the dictation test. All our lectures have been recorded and they can be accessed on our website. Yenny will post the web link in chat and you're welcome to watch them. We are interested in history for all sorts of various reasons. I myself have been greatly influenced by T.S. Eliot's theory of the interwoven relationship of a past, present, and the future. We constantly review the past in present, as the present influences the way we see the past, while the past enlightens us in seeing the present, and the future is determined by the present and the past. So I'm very interested in Michael's close examination of a dictation test in today's talk. His topic is Australia's dictation test, a gross piece of chicanery. Dr. Michael Williams is the adjunct professor of this institute and is a scholar of Chinese Australian history. He is a founding member of the Chinese Australian Historical Society. His publications include Returning Home with the Glory and Australia's Dictation Test. The test, it was a crime to fail. His website, Chinese Australian History in 88 Objects, was shortlisted for the 2020 Premier's Digital History Prize. Michael is currently working on a history of the rogue Chinese goldfield walkers entitled Every Requisite for a Campaign Upon the Goldfields. As previously, we will take questions from the audience at the end of the lecture. So please post your questions at the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Now, please welcome Dr. Michael Williams to give us the lecture.
Good. Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you, Jin. And welcome everybody to the talk. I'll just bring up my PowerPoint and we'll get started. Oh, where's my PowerPoint? Here we go. Okay, some of you may have heard me talk before on the dictation test. That was usually as I was doing research for the book, which has now been published, Australia's Dictation Test. The test that was a crime to fail. So in today's talk, I'll be basically going through the chapters that are within that book. And so, of course, to give it an alternative title, I'm calling today's talk Australia's Dictation Test, a gross piece of chicanery. And I'll explain a little bit where that phrase comes from. But test that was a crime to fail or a gross piece of chicanery are both equally accurate descriptions of the dictation test. So today I'll just give you an overview of what we'll be talking about. I'll give a bit of a brief introduction. Then I'll talk about some of the historical background to how the test came about. Then I'll focus on some of the administrative elements that put it together and made it what in the phrase of the day was called to place its sufficiency beyond doubt, meaning to make it a test that could not be passed. Then I'll do a bit of an overview of how the test and the administration of the test evolved over some 50 years or so that it existed. And then we'll double back a little bit and talk about specifically how it affected or was affected by people of Chinese birth and Chinese heritage in Australia and elsewhere, before looking at another side of the coin, which is to say how it affected or was affected by concepts of Europeanness and whiteness. Because, of course, if you're going to have an immigration restriction that involves defining who is desirable and who is undesirable. And again, these were terms that were used at the time. Then you have to define what do you mean by the desirable, in this case, white, and it's something that evolved over time. Finally, we'll look at the passing of the test and the implications for that before concluding with the question, has Australia passed the test? That is to say, have we really overcome this period of Australian history? So first I'll begin by telling you a story that I think encapsulates some of the concepts of the White Australia Project. And I use the term project rather than White Australia policy because I think it's important to understand that a policy implies that some kind of legislation, as the Dictation Test and the Immigration Restriction Act was, and therefore it's something that can be rescinded and replaced with other legislation associated, say, with the multicultural policy that we have today. But really the White Australia Project was a much broader idea than that. So it was legislation, but it was also psychology, it was also beliefs, and this is something broader. And I'll explain that a little bit with the story of the bin Salik family. So this is a family living in Broome originally in the 1930s, and Biddy bin Salik there on your right was identified as an Aboriginal person of the Kimberleys, and she wanted to marry Salim on the left there, and he was a person who was a pearl diver, had been born overseas in Dutch East, what was then called the Dutch East Indies, and you think that would be a simple thing, but the bishop of the area decided that he didn't want them to marry, and he tried to intervene. Now, under the laws of the time, if Biddy had actually been full or half caste Aboriginal, as they would have asserted her, then she would have had to get permission to marry. But in reality, Biddy's father had been from the Philippines, and her mother was only Aboriginal on one side of the family. That made Biddy, in the terminology of the times, a quadroon, meaning that she was only a quarter Aboriginal, and that meant that legally she couldn't be told who she could marry. So the bishop didn't stop there. He instead then wrote directly to the Premier of West Australia at the time and said, well, what you should be doing is getting rid of Salim. He should be ejected from Australia. And the tool that the Premier of West Australia tried to use would have been, oops, I've lost my arrow here. Oh, nothing's moving. Just a sec. I have to try and, oops. Sorry, for some reason my screen is frozen and I won't be able to do anything. I can't move my PowerPoint. And I've lost my cursor. Give me a second to try, and I might have to restart everything.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I have to restart the whole computer, I think.
Can you try press the space bar that may move the slides?
No, I've tried that.
No?
Can't even use the escape to get back to the original.
You have two screens open or only one screen?
I only got the one screen open, but I can't get it, bring up my cursor into play to allow me to do anything.
If you use the swipe pad to move your cursor instead of a mouse, does it work?
I don't have a mouse. I'm only using my pad.
Okay.
So sorry, I'm going to have to try and.
Yeah, no problem.
I may have to be out for a minute. You'll have to talk among yourselves, I think. May have to come back into the Zoom as well.
Still not moving?
No, nothing's happening. Oop.
Maybe try stop sharing and sharing again.
Well, I've got no cursor to allow me to do anything.
Oh,
wait, there we go. I've just got the cursor back.
okay.
Oh, okay, good.
Okay.
We're back live. Okay, so basically the Premier of West Australia wrote to the then Prime Minister of Australia, Robert Menzies, to demand that Salim there be ejected from Australia by, of course, employing the Dictation Test. And this would have been employed in such a way, regardless of how much English he had, in such a way that would have created him as a prohibited immigrant and ejected him of Australia. Now, that didn't happen in this case because Salim was, in fact, a good pearl diver. And I think, although we don't have any archival evidence of this, the assumption is that nobody wanted to get rid of him. They wanted him to stay. So instead, the family moved to Darwin, where they did marry and where they had a child, Mary Ann. And the result of that was Mary Ann grew up to become a Harvard graduate, a professor. She's actually an adjunct professor of this Western Sydney University as well. Here she's getting an award from NAIDOC as an esteemed elder in 2018. And what I want to clarify here is that this is part of the wider scope of the White Australia Project, that the premiers of West Australia, the Prime Minister of Australia, had the power and the inclination to stop people from getting married, stop families from establishing themselves. And it's only that they failed that we have an esteemed person such as Mary Ann bin Salik living today in Darwin. Now, that's not to say that the only result of the failure of the White Australia policy was to create Harvard graduates and so forth. I mean, it wouldn't matter what kind of career people had. People's lives were affected and influenced by this, and it was a wide-ranging project designed to create a white Australia. Now, there was, of course, some opposition to this. Senator Harney, for example, is the one who called it a gross piece of chicanery, but he did that not to oppose the White Australia as such, but simply to oppose what he considered to be the deception that was the test. And because what he preferred was simply to say it's really an exclusion based on colour. And the Labor Party certainly agree with him. They moved a motion in the first Australian Parliament to say that instead of a test, it should be that Australia will exclude natives of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. But for reasons that I'll go into soon, this compromise, which was the dictation test, was what it was enacted instead. Now, there was, again, other opposition to the whole idea of this immigration restriction and the White Australia policy. The most direct that I've seen is this early one from South Australia, from just before Federation, saying that the idea of an Australian colony introducing legislation to keep the coloured man out of Australia is as absurd as it is unique, considering that the Aboriginal inhabitants are black. So that's a fairly direct and straightforward one. But most of the opposition came from people calling themselves Christians on a kind of a generalised idea that all Christians, all people under God, should be equal and should be treated equally. But their voices were very muted and certainly had no sway. A more interesting one comes from E.W. Cole, who wrote a whole book with 50 reasons why he thought the Immigration Restriction Act and White Australia would fail. And his most interesting reason why he thought it was failed, I think, was this one. Because the humanity of Australia itself will in time revolt at such a selfish and inhuman law, will probably gradually relax it and finally abolish it altogether. So in this, E.W. Cole was right, though whether he would have realised it would take some 2 generations before this would happen, I don't know. So the White Australia game. How did it come about? So the short answer is it was a combination of imperial hypocrisy meeting a long history of colonial whiteness. But more specifically, it began with very much with the London Conference and a compromise known as the Natal Test, which evolved into the Education Test, which finally evolved into the Dictation Test. And what I mean by this imperial hypocrisy was the idea of the British Empire. So the British had this idea by the late 19th century that their empire was one big happy family. It wasn't an equal family, but it was a big family with themselves at the top, the white settler nations perhaps as a rank 2, and everybody else under that, knowing their place. And this meant that they did have this concept of being a British subject, and that of course included everybody in India at the time. They were all meant to be British subjects, and they didn't like the idea of them being discriminated against by other parts of the empire. But certainly the white parts of the empire didn't agree with this philosophy. And in 1897, there was a meeting of the premiers of the various Australian colonies, as well as Canada and South Africa and New Zealand, to meet to discuss this very issue. And they met with their overlord, their in this case, the Joseph Chamberlain, the Secretary of the Colonies, to discuss this. And it was Joseph Chamberlain who summarised what they were after by saying, what you want is to avoid stigmatising them by name as being unfit for civilised life. So basically, he offered this compromise, this hypocrisy of saying, well, look, of course, we want them all to be equal as British subjects, but we understand you want to exclude them, but as long as you don't appear to be excluding them. And so the Natal test was his selection, Natal being a colony that later became part of the South African Union, which had been having a large immigration for people from India. The white colonists in Natal didn't like that. So they eventually introduced the Natal test, which was a nominal literacy test, test of reading and writing, which he felt would exclude most, Joseph Chamberlain felt would exclude most people. And if it allowed a few people in who could read and write, that was okay. And so that was the compromise. So again, a very discriminatory test, the one that was nominally passable by some people. So how did Australia end up with a test that was completely fake? And here, you were talking about administration, we're talking about how they put together the Immigration Restriction Act and administered it in the first years of the Australian Federation. And so some people did in fact pass. Between 1901 and 1909, some 59 people did pass the test, although the actual ability to place its sufficiency beyond doubt probably happened by June of 1903. So within about a year and a half of the passing of the dictation test. So just to clarify, so there were quite a number of dictation tests around. So after that meeting in 1897, both New South Wales and Tasmania, as well as West Australia, passed their own tests. West Australia decided to introduce the idea of 50 words from any English author, which the Commonwealth then took up. New Zealand not only had its own test, but it also introduced a special one just for Chinese people. And they did this because the original test was one that people could pass, and they thought too many Chinese people were actually passing. Australia, on the other hand, is the only one that established a test that could not be passed. Some people say, oh, the origin of the tests are in the United States, but there's really no evidence for that. There was an attempt by some people in the United States to introduce a test of their own. This was quite different in the sense that it was meant to be given to whole families, and if one person of the family could pass, the whole family could enter into the United States. It did, in fact, pass Congress, but it was then vetoed by the president, so never became law in the United States. So this idea of the dictation test or some kind of English education test was certainly fairly much a British Empire in origin. So how to make the test unpassable? Well, first off, you set up a bureaucracy, in this case, the Department of External Affairs, although the departmental names changed over the years. You put someone in charge, in this case, Attlee Hunt. Now, Attlee Hunt began life as a personal secretary to Edmund Barton, the first Prime Minister of Australia, and then he was appointed head of this new department. And this new department took over all the customs offices around Australia that were part of the colonies and turned them into Commonwealth bureaucracy. And so, of course, what he had to do was to argue with the officers and to convince them what was going on. So both Barton and Attlee Hunt were very coy at the beginning, in 1901, 1902, about how they described the tests and how they explained it to officials. And so as a result, some of the officials didn't understand what was going on, and they allowed people to pass. For example, this is one dictation test, one of the few people who actually passed the test, Benjamin Robertson. He was given the test in English. He could read and write in English. Neatness didn't count in the test, so he wrote it out and he passed. Benjamin was actually from Jamaica, and as a result of that, his skin wasn't as white as Attlee Hunt and others would have liked. Attlee Hunt had to write and complain about why this person was given a test at all, or having been given a test, why was he given it in a language he could understand. So eventually, Attlee Hunt had to be more forthright about what the test was all about, and he had to explain to his officials around Australia that it was meant to be an absolute bar to admission. This is the way it was supposed to work. And a good example of how that is this case of Kung Yo Wei. Now, Kung Yo Wei, of course, was not someone trying to migrate to Australia. He was a famous Chinese intellectual who had been exiled by the Qing government at the time and was trying to set up an empire reform society. So they say he was a political operative trying to organize people, Chinese people around the world, to help him to change the Qing government. And he, at one stage, contemplated coming to Australia. He never did in the end, but he was thinking about it. And as a favour to the Qing government, the Chinese government, the British government wrote to the Australian government, the Commonwealth of Australia, and said, will you bar this person from coming to Australia? And so there's a letter where all the officials are told, if Kang Youwei does try to come to Australia, it seems like he could speak English, therefore you must make sure you give him the test in Spanish or French or Italian or some other language that he cannot pass. So this was a very early example of them using the test as an absolute bar. It's a fake test, in fact, and in this case also a political use of the dictation test. And there's will be more examples of that over the years. So finally, I've told you that the administration was mostly put in place within about a year and a half, but a few people did pass right up to 1909. And the last person to pass was a man named Lorenzo de Gara, living in Cossack in West Australia. He'd been, again, another pearl diver. He asked to stay in Australia. And in Cossack, the person who was in charge of the Immigration Restriction Act and the dictation test was also the postmaster. And he obviously hadn't got all the memos from Atlee Hunt. And he gave Lorenzo a test in English, which Lorenzo was able to pass. And then Lorenzo also said that he could paint. So for good measure, the postmaster, a customs official, asked him to do a drawing of Advanced Australia, which he did, Advanced Australia in watercolour. And so the postmaster decided that he could pass the test. This isn't actually the drawing by Lorenzo, but it seemed very close to the description, so I give it as an example. So Atlee Hunt felt this was a matter of carelessness, but he had to admit that Lorenzo de Gara was under no obligation to leave the Commonwealth. So having set up the mechanism to run the dictation test and the Immigration Restriction Act, Atlee Hunt was very pleased, and he thought that the whole dictation test was very good on account of the elasticity which it permits. And this elasticity was because of the great official discretion. So basically it was customs officials standing at ports, standing on boats, and deciding you will be given a test or you will not be given a test. And it was, it was as simple as that. There was not a great deal of administrative formality involved, although it was a legal case. So they had to go to courts. And once the courts got involved, there were a number of challenges and adaptations that had to take place. But before that happened, the administration had to also decide what to do about people who were already living in Australia before 1901. Now, as you know, the biggest non-European, non-white group of people living in Australia, aside from Indigenous people, were, of course, Chinese people. Now, there was never any question of throwing Chinese people out or expelling them from Australia, as they did do with people from the South Sea Islands who had their own act to try and remove as many South Sea Islanders as possible. Instead, for people of Chinese birth, they were issued with certificates of domicile or later certificates exempting from the dictation test. And this was because, as I'll explain later on, people from of Chinese birth living in Australia often wanted to go back to China and to come back to Australia, to travel back and forth. And so these certificates were a kind of re-entry visa for people who were given permanent residence. People of Chinese birth were not allowed to become citizens. They couldn't become subjects or citizens, or British subjects. They couldn't be naturalised, but they could remain in Australia, and they could go back and forth as long as they could demonstrate they'd been already in Australia resident before 1901. And so thousands of these certificates were issued over the years, right up to 1958. Another certificate, very similar name, but not to be confused, is the Certificate of Exemption. Now, this was a temporary certificate for people wanting to come into Australia as a merchant, perhaps, or as a student, or for other reasons. And so these also had to be issued for people. And sometimes people were able to get them extended. So you could get one for maybe 2 or 3 years and then extend it again and again. And some people were able to stay quite a long time in Australia for the rest of their lives in Australia. But most people got them for temporary purposes and then returned. And again, most of these were issued to people of Chinese origin, but not exclusively. So, of course, the dictation test was a legal instrument. So you failed the test, it was actually a crime. You then became a prohibited immigrant. People could go to jail for that. that meant you could also challenge that in court, and people did. There were quite a number of challenges, and I'll just give one as an example because it's just too many to go over, but it'll give you an example of how the courts dealt with it. So basically, the test was meant to be, original act said the test was of 50 words. And then, of course, some clever lawyer counted the number of words and decided that this test was actually 51 or 52 words. And the court agreed that it was an invalid test for that reason. Now, that kind of challenge, successful in that particular case, simply meant that they went back to Parliament and changed the Act. And instead, they changed the words to be at least 50 words. And these were the kinds of results of most of the challenges. They meant that there were modifications, legal modifications to keep things going. So for most of the period of the dictation test right up to the 1950s, there was relatively a little change, particularly from these legal challenges. Consuls, particularly Chinese consuls, often challenged the Act, but they mostly were able to get procedures changed about handprints, how long you could stay on a boat, but identification processes. The biggest challenge came from smuggling, from actually just coming into Australia illegally, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in another section. Japan, as a government, was particularly outraged at the whole concept of the White Australia policy and dictation that's been applied to them. They mostly opposed it on racial grounds, on the grounds that they didn't want to be seen as equal to or treated in the same way as people from China. The British government too also challenged things on occasions, again, for similar reasons of wanting to have British subjects treated a bit more equally, regardless of colour. Finally, just again to give another example of how people were treated, the Act, gradually the administrators of the Act, because of smuggling, because of challenges to themselves, decided to try and give themselves as much power as possible. So they had powers to raid people. They had, the immigration officials at the end had more power than the police to search and look for people who were supposedly illegal in Australia. And they also changed the onus of proof and made it almost, once you're accused of being a prohibited immigrant, you had to prove you weren't. And this caught up Mr. Ali Abdul here, who'd been living in Australia, running a small store in Redfern. He was accused of being in Australia after 1901. So he was challenged, he had to take it to the courts. And because of the onus of proof included, he had to prove what ship he came on and he couldn't remember. A magistrate, despite numerous witnesses testifying to his having been in Australia for many, many years, the court still had to find him guilty as a prohibited immigrant until it finally took it to the High Court, which he won in this instance, but not before his business was destroyed. And he told the newspapers afterwards, "It has cost me a lot of money to stay in Australia. It is my country. It is all right. Back in Lahore, I am a stranger." So this is just, again, another example of an individual and how the administration of this test has affected him. The government also was much pressured by people who thought they weren't doing enough. So there were quite a number of people who thought that this smuggling was in the thousands, and there'd be newspaper reports attacking the bureaucrats and attacking the government for allowing too many people into Australia. And they responded to this very often with investigations and tightening of legislation. And they also made sure their administrators were of the right type, that is to say that they agreed with the principles of a White Australia. And a good example of that was when the Commonwealth took over the Northern Territory, which didn't happen until 1911. They took it over from the South Australian government. And then they had to appoint an administrator. And when they did that, they made sure that administrator agreed with the principles of, as they saw it, of the White Australia. And the reason for that was that the Northern Territory at the time had a majority population of non-whites, particularly a number of Chinese and others living there. And although, as I said before, they weren't able to legally exclude people, expel them, they did want to discourage people from living there. And so the administrator was meant to make life difficult for people living in Darwin and other places, which they did do. And of course, a great many people did then return to China as a result. But many of them just simply moved into Queensland because, again, one of the effects of the Federation was that the poll tax borders that had stopped people from entering or moving into places such as Queensland disappeared. And so many people simply travelled into Queensland and Cairns and other places where there was more work opportunities. So there are other aspects of the test that challenged and exempted it, challenged and influenced it. Political, as we'll talk about later on, class. Many people at the time were considered to be of superior standing, was the terminology. And so someone of that status was not meant to be treated the same way as workers or market gardeners and so forth. And so sometimes people of that class, of that origin, challenged the administration. But probably the main loophole within the White Australia policy, the White Australia project at this time was economic, particularly the pearling industry, which was the idea being that you couldn't get white people to do this hard work. They tried a few times and it failed. But so there was quite a numerous number of people who were allowed in on temporary exemptions in order to do the kind of work that kept certain businesses going, including the pearl shell industry, which is quite a lucrative one for most of the first half of the 20th century. So Quong Tat very early on wrote to the Prime Minister Edmund Martin, and he said, "I know that a man would need to live for 3 generations to pass this test." Now, he said that even at a time when a few people were passing the test, because no Chinese person ever passed that test. Even though, as I said before, the customs officials were a bit confused about how the dictation test was to be administered, they also knew that certainly Chinese people weren't the ones to pass it. They'd been used to the poll taxes before Federation. And when Quong Tat said a man would need to live for 3 generations, he meant you need to live that long to learn that many languages if you were to be able to pass the test. So the Immigration Restriction Act, the Dictation Test, was always aimed at Chinese people, and they were always the largest number of people affected by the Dictation Test. And this was for a number of reasons. One, of course, was that they simply were the largest non-white group in Australia. But it was also, that wasn't the only reason. The other reason was because they also travelled a lot. Most of the Chinese people living in Australia at the end of the 19th century were men, and they come originally to Australia to remit money, to earn money in Australia and remit it back to families in their villages. And that meant that they often wanted to travel to see those families. And they did that during the working lifetime, travelling back and forth on ships such as the Taiping. These ran routes. These were mixed cargo and passenger boats that would go all the way to Japan, come back down through Hong Kong, through the Philippines, and all the way down the Queensland coast to Sydney, and then to Melbourne. And there were other ships that went around via Perth as well. And so these were the kinds of ships where people had to be mustered when they came to an Australian port. Everybody's ID would be checked to ensure that they had the right certificates, or they were to be allowed in Australia, or they would be returned on the ship. And just to clarify, this is a house in a village in China built by a market gardener in Sydney. So this is what the money was for. The money was going back to build better houses, to educate children. You can go to this village today and you can see quite a number of the houses like this, and the villagers will tell you that this house is from Sydney, the house next door is from Canada, the house beside that is from Peru. And this is part of what was happening in southern China at the time of labour migration, going out through Hong Kong, around the Pacific, to places where people could earn monies and come back to help grow their families in southern China. And these villages and towns within southern China in the 1920s and 30s particularly were very dependent upon this remittance money flowing in from around the Pacific, including Australia. Excuse me. So as this idea of people travelling back and forth wasn't just merely a matter of gardeners too, it was a matter of families, and kind of very multinational families grew up. This is a family, a mixed family that grew up in Strathfield in Sydney. Some of them were Australian born, some of them not. It's a family that decided to permanently move out of Australia back to China at one point for business reasons. And then that business failed, and so they decided to come back to Australia, which they were perfectly entitled to do, although their certificates of exempting dictation test had actually expired by that stage. Now, that wasn't a major problem. Getting these expired certificates renewed or extended was perfectly possible. It just meant bureaucratic delay. And this journalist from the Sydney Morning Herald didn't know and made this a special story. Chinese family prohibited from landing is meant to be kind of a shock headline, not so much, mainly because they're obviously a middle-class family, they're obviously a well-educated, wealthy family. And so the question is, why is this family being prohibited? But in actual fact, this family is quite typical a Chinese Australian family. Just to give you another example, if you look at the woman there in the middle here, this woman here is the mother of Jeff Fat. And for those of you who don't know Jeff Fat is the purple wiggle, or at least the original purple wiggle. And so again, an example of how integrated this history is into the history of Australia. So this whole connection with people of Chinese origin, it meant that there was a lot of interaction, response and counter-response. Particularly, many people were involved in smuggling, coming in either on false documents or maybe as posing as sailors on the boat and then jumping ship. So quite a large number of people did come in over the years, but it's very hard to determine exactly how many. But despite those numbers, the numbers generally of the Chinese Australian community did fall quite dramatically over the first half of the 20th century as the White Australia policy was intended to act. The community did remain and then did gradually begin to grow again as World War II progressed, and then afterwards, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. So the other side of this coin then is, of course, how do you define European? How do you define what is European, what is white, what is desirable and undesirable? So the terminology of the time very much was you apply the dictation test to whoever you consider to be undesirable. But what if the undesirable person happens to be white? In this case, this is Mrs. Freer, who was given a dictation test in the 1930s. And this caused quite a stir in the newspapers at the time, because it wasn't entirely clear why she was being given the test, but it was certainly clear that it was shocking that someone who looked like us, as the phrase went at the time, looked like us, was being given a dictation test, which people thought should only be applied to people of non-white look. So this was a case of morality. The minister was being a bit coy. It was a matter of being unmarried women, sex outside of marriage, a range of things that they didn't want to talk about too much. A more obvious case is the more political one. In this case, Egon Kisch, who was a Czech journalist, a communist, who was invited to Australia in the 1930s to talk about fascism and the rise of fascism in Europe. The government at the time, with Attorney General Menzies, wasn't so anti-fascist as they might have been, weren't quite cluey as to what was happening in Europe, and they tried to get rid of him. And ultimately, after a number of tries, gave him a dictation test. And this, for many people, is probably the only aspect of the dictation test they know. It's much more well known. It's particularly well known that he was given a test in Scots Gaelic. They challenged it to the High Court, and the High Court decided that Scots Gaelic wasn't a European language for the purposes of the test. And this caused some furor and complaints among Scottish descended people in Australia. But it's a dangerous thing to think you know something. So if you only know this about the dictation test, it means that you don't know anything about the dictation test. You only know what is of concern to, you could say, white political history. That's to say, it's to do with fascism, it's to do with Robert Menzies, it's to do with a kind of very unrepresentative use of the dictation test. And if that obscures your knowledge of how the test was applied to thousands of other people, particularly people of Chinese origin in Australia, then it's a dangerous thing. I mean, I emphasize this point because obviously when people ask what you're working on, I say I'm working on the dictation test. Very often they would bring this example up as the only thing they actually knew about the test. And so, of course, what we need to do is be more aware of the broader history, the broader perspective. So sometimes it's not just a matter of not knowing something. It's a matter of thinking you know something, and this obscures your learning in other areas. So this whole idea of defining what was white, what was race, in the beginning of the test, it's interesting, there's very little questioning of this in 1901. People just assume they know. But as the years go by, they're making more and more efforts to define what is white and what is considered to be desirable look in a person coming to Australia. And that's paralleled as that kind of definition becomes more and more defined and written down, such as the heading here, is the applicant of European white race or descent. That was actually on a form from the 1950s as people, mass migration is coming in from Europe. And they begin to ask this question. Well, then if you ask that question, you've got to answer it. How do you answer it? And so this is parallel with an increasing distastefulness for that kind of assessment of people. More and more people are beginning to do what E.W. Cole said, the humanity of Australians are beginning to revolt about this thing. But just to show just how far it went, immigration officials even as late as the 1960s employed what they considered to be a Martin Place test. And the Martin Place test was that they would look at a potential immigrant and they would say, well, I've got to imagine that person walking down Martin Place. And if people stopped and stared at them, then they were the wrong colour. People, if they could walk down Martin Place without being stared at, well, that was okay. So that was the kind of how silly the whole idea became. And this is even in the years after the dictation test had been abolished. So there are other influences here, refugees, again, class, politics, and particularly colour and look was influencing how things were to be administered. An example of that, again, is this as an American jazz band. Now, there were relatively, again, apart from Indigenous people, relatively few people of black skin in Australia, but that didn't stop white Australians from being absolutely paranoid and horrified at the idea of people with dark skin coming into Australia. In this case, these people didn't, of course, come to migrate. They came to tour as a jazz band. But this didn't stop them from getting into trouble. And in fact, the trouble they got into even went as far as federal cabinet. The cabinet itself debated this and seemed to actually want to ban jazz musicians from Australia as a result, which the Musicians Union at the time in Australia was actually in favour of for their own purposes. The problem here was that these men, young, interesting men, arrived in Australia and, of course, picked up a lot of white girls who were quite happy to party with them. And this horrified people observing this. And one interesting aspect of this case, apart from them having their tour cut short and them being expelled from Australia, is that the police at one stage wanted to raid the flats where they were living and didn't dare. And they didn't dare because they knew they were living in an area where, as the detective expressed it, the people of that area can't quite be trusted to have the same attitudes towards race and morals as we do. So they knew that not everybody agreed with this kind of race-based or colour-based looking of people. The people where they were living at the time was Darlinghurst in Sydney, a decided working class area, and by coincidence, the boarding house where they were living was run by a Chinese woman, or at least a woman that looked Chinese, Australian-born or not, I don't know. So, what happened? Gradually, of course, as E.W. Cole said, the humanity of Australia itself did revolt, and the test began, and the White Australia Project began to fade. It actually ended in 1958, but the White Australia Project, of course, as we know, continued for many years after, a very slow death, as some people have characterised it. The other thing to remember, the important thing to remember, that although the dictation test was abolished in 1958, it was abolished to maintain the White Australia Project, not to dismantle it. Government at the time, Harold Holt as Immigration Minister, Menzies as Prime Minister, only abolished the dictation test because it had become increasingly a source of ridicule for Australia. And this was because of international pressure, by and large. In a post-colonial world, the independent Asian nations were looking at Australia and beginning to say, well, what's this racist nation doing? Why are they so prejudiced against us? And the dictation test was certainly considered to be a part of that, and a very distasteful part of that. So the test was finally abolished in 1958, but as I say, the government at the time did so in order really to maintain the White Australia policy and to be able to say to Australia's Asian neighbours, look, see, we don't have the test anymore. We're not racist here. Nothing to look at here. And this was mostly due to international pressures. Whoops, sorry, I should have mentioned that before. I'll mention that later on. But one thing I want to emphasise here, or just to characterise here, is how focused Australia was on the White Australia policy, even in the middle of the 20th century. So World War II comes along. America and Australia are both allies of China against the Japanese. America signs a treaty with China, and as a result of that, does do away with its own anti-Chinese discriminatory laws and incorporates Chinese immigration into its more general immigration program. which was, of course, discriminatory, but everybody at least was discriminated against together. Australia, on the other hand, refused, despite American pressure, to sign a treaty with China. And that was mainly because they were afraid that then China would be able to pressure Australia to loosen up its White Australia policy. And an interesting example of this is this propaganda film that the Americans made called Why We Fight. It was just about, the needing to fight the Japanese, support China and so forth. And tagged at the end of it in a very strained accent is these few words. We ask of no nation other than to be left alone to live our own lives in our own way. And this is a kind of rather pathetic a sense of Australia saying, look, help us get rid of the Japanese. Once we're rid of the Japanese, we want to be left alone and do our own thing. And of course, that wasn't to be. Australia wasn't left alone. There was pressure. And as I said, with E.W. Coles saying the humanity of Australia itself will in time revolt. And this began to happen in the 50s and 60s, very slowly, but more and more people internally will begin to protest the White Australia policy in its very premises. 60s, the Labor Party finally abolished its own platform of the White Australia policy, but of course, it wasn't able to get into power for many years later. One of the things that probably affected people's attitudes towards Asian migration in general were the students. So in the 50s and 60s, more and more people began to come from Asia, mainly as students in the universities, nominally under the Colombo Plan, and certainly the government emphasised the Colombo Plan as where these students were coming from. But in reality, the vast majority of students weren't under the Colombo Plan at all, particularly Chinese heritage students who were coming from Hong Kong and Malaysia and other parts of the diaspora. They were coming as private students. And what that meant was that they were under no obligation to return to their countries of origin as Colombo Plan students would have been. So that meant more and more people were coming into Australia. And these were people who were educated, they were young, they were articulate, and so they didn't fit the stereotype that people had. And so this was a gradual changing of that stereotype, a gradual realisation that, Australia wasn't so threatened by having more people of an Asian look coming to live there. But again, it was a long, slow process. So finally, we have to ask ourselves, has Australia passed the test? What conclusions can we draw from this history of the test? Was Cole right? Was it a question of Australia finally revolting against this kind of attitude towards people? So here I just want to say one of the reasons why I began to do this research. Originally, if you remember, there's a couple of Australian governments have introduced or fiddled with the concept of citizenship tests. The Howard government introduced citizenship tests, and the Turnbull government modified them again. And at both times, people mentioned the dictation tests when they started talking about citizenship tests. They said things like, "Oh, this kind of raises the ghost of dictation tests. This is kind of harkens back to an older style of doing things." And of course, as an historian, I rejected that and said, "Well, no, they're completely different things. The citizenship tests are about obviously defining what kind of a test for becoming a citizen. Dictation test was about getting into the country at all." But then I realised that, and of course, when people did that, they also often talked of the dictation test as if the tests were nominally passable. And of course, again, I realised this was a mistake. The tests were entirely faked. People couldn't quite get their head around this idea that the tests weren't just very difficult, they were in fact completely unpassable. So when I looked at this idea of comparing the citizenship test with the dictation test, what I realised that what people were identifying quite rightly was the level of hypocrisy that was involved. So what they were looking at is that both sets of tests were really about pretending to be about literacy, pretending to be about education, pretending to be about levels of English. But in reality, they were about the same thing. They were about this idea that we only want people here who are like us. And then certainly that was the dictation test was all about, and the citizenship test, in a broader framework, but nevertheless the same kind of idea that we're trying to make sure that we only have people in Australia who are like us in some, in more current times, undetermined or ill-defined way. And you can see this happening in how people reject boat people and so forth. Many of those people on the boats are, of course, exactly the same as the kind of people who arrive in Australia under other circumstances. Nevertheless, the hostility and the fear there, I think, harkens back to the kinds of reasons that were underlay the dictation test. So some academics, about 20 years ago now, defined it this way. It is not easy to determine whether Australia is remarkable for the speed at which it transformed the radicalised Commonwealth of 1901 into a multicultural society, or remarkable for the persistence of racial stereotypes and yellow power anxieties a century after the creation of the Commonwealth. And so I think this question is even more valid today, particularly in the last few years with the hostility towards China growing and therefore the kind of backlash that has happened with some people of Chinese origin, Chinese descent, Chinese heritage in Australia. We still haven't quite figured out where we're at. And this again is why I want to emphasise a White Australia project as opposed to a policy. We can easily say the policy is gone, but has the project itself completely faded away? Has Australia, in fact, passed the test? And I think it's important to emphasise that although these are the broader conceptual questions that we need to ask ourselves, we should also continue to remember how individuals were impacted. Marianne is an example of someone who managed to avoid being impacted too much by the White Australia policy. But we've got to think of the thousands of others, perhaps, who were impacted in ways that we can't know today. People like Ali Abdul and the way he was impacted. Again, he went to High Court. He did get his name in the newspaper, so we know a little bit about his case. There were many, many other people who would not have been able to challenge it quite so much, and we don't know what happened to them. The Wong Yi family, again, this was a relatively wealthy family that was able to kind of pass through the bureaucracy without too much difficulty. But again, there are many, many others who would have had other difficulties, who maybe gave up or who were sent back. Again, we have to think in terms of how these things were influenced, both in various ways. So finally, do we see that Australia is still haunted by this heads I win, tails you lose test, that it was a crime, the crime to fail? So I just leave it there for now. This is, again, a very brief overview. If you wanted to learn more, certainly there's a book, Australia's Dictation Test, the test it was a crime to fail. If you find it's harder to read a whole book, I have written a number of essays on particular aspects of the test, which it can all be found on the website Chinese Australian History in 88 Objects. And now I'll leave it there for today, and I'm welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you again, Michael, for this very interesting talk, and we hope to see you back next year. And for the audience, we will have our last lecture on 7th of December by our PhD candidate, Christopher Chan. So that will be the last one of 2022. And anyone, as I call it again, who is interested in doing this talk, please get in touch with us. And we're going to run 2023 series next year. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, everyone, the audience, and have a good evening.
All right, thank you.